Hello and welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast. I'm your host, Jack Perks, and today we're covering the rather contentious issue of predation in angling. Strap yourselves in. I'm going to be speaking to the Angling Trust, Mark Owen, Head of Fisheries, and get the angling perspective, and I'm also going to be speaking to Dave Webb from the UK Wild Otter Trust. Now, I did want to try and get someone on to talk from the birds perspective, if you like, but the RSPB politely declined, although they did send me some papers which was very useful, and the BTO just didn't get back to me, so I'm going to be covering that side of things. To start with, some of you might be like, what is predation in angling? Isn't that a normal thing? What's the problem? The predation angling conflict, if you like, is that in recent years there are more otters, more cormorants and goosehanders specifically. There are other species, but we'll focus on those three today. And obviously they eat fish. Anglers quite like fish, so in certain areas there can be a conflict of interest, shall we say. I don't expect everyone to know who I am. I suspect there'll be a fair few people tuning in for the first time for this one. So just to let you know where my hat lies, I am a wildlife photographer and cameraman by trade. I'm a naturalist. I love the outdoors and nature, whether it's bird watching, whether it's walking through woodlands, exploring fungi and insects. I love it all. But I'm also a very passionate angler. I love fly fishing for trout. I love trotting for chub and roach. I love fishing on the coast for whatever things turn up, dogfish normally. I'm a very passionate angler, which has led me to carve out a career largely filming fish, and that's what I'm predominantly known for. Now, the reason that I'm telling you this, and many of you already know this, is so that you know that I'm kind of neutral. That I'm just as invested in both sides. It's not like I've got a weight too heavy either side. So I'm going to try and present this in a relatively open way that you can make your own mind up. And I'll let you know my thoughts at the end. Might not be what you think either. But we'll delve into it. So to start with, let's talk about cormorants. Okay, let's start with the Black Death, as some anglers like to call them, cormorants. Now, I'm going to be referencing lots of papers here. I've had to trawl through some, if I'm perfectly honest, very boring and very long scientific papers to get the nuggets out for you, the listeners. So I hope you all appreciate the shite that I've had to read to get this far. Bearing in mind I'm heavily dyslexic, and it's absolutely boiling today as I'm recording this. But I've done it for you. So I've got quite a few. I will put links to these papers in the description. So if you don't like what's being said, take it up with whoever wrote the paper. I don't want to hear it. One thing I will point out before we crack on is one of the big misconceptions over cormorants in the UK. So there's 3 points I want to make. Firstly, they are native. A lot of people say these are non-native, they're invasive. They're a native bird, albeit coastal, but they're still native. If puffins came inland, we wouldn't call them non-native. We would call that just migration more than anything. Cormorants are native. Secondly, cormorants have not come inland because there's no fish in the sea. This is something that my fellow anglers love to peddle. Oh, and there's a wanker on a motorbike outside. My fellow anglers love to peddle the fact that cormorants have come inland because there's less fish in the sea. And the fact of the matter is this just simply isn't true. There is no evidence to suggest that cormorants are starving on the coast and that's why they've come inland. If anything, as evidenced by how efficient hunters cormorants are, they're the last bird that's going to struggle catching fish. So they haven't come inland because there is less fish on the coastline. What's happened is that the cormorants predominantly that we get inland are Carbosinensis, and these are the Baltic cormorant. This is a subspecies of our coastal cormorants. Now, these Baltic cormorants live on the Baltic Sea, and the Baltic Sea is a mixture of fresh and salt water. So you get this really unusual ecosystem where you get marine fish like cod, wrasse and flounder mixing with freshwater fish like perch, pike and roach. So those cormorants do eat freshwater fish and they do feed in fresh water. What the prevailing theory is that during the 1960s there was a particularly harsh winter, or a few harsh winters on continental Europe, and as often happens when you have a harsh winter in Europe, that pushes birds to the UK because being an island nation, we don't generally get as bad a winter as further inland in Europe. Now, those cormorants moved to the UK, and rather than leaving, they just stayed because everything was perfect for them. There was brilliant habitat, no predators, lovely place to stay. And that is where these inland cormorants have come from. We have actually found since that some of the coastal cormorants have moved inland as well, but that could just be that there are so many cormorants inland that's sort of drawing the coastal ones in. So you do see this sort of mix of cormorants, but predominantly it's Carbo sinensis, the Baltic cormorant that we find inland. The last point is that you only get them in rural areas, and they're definitely moving into towns and cities now. In fact, if you go to London, often along Regent's Canal, you'll see cormorants, and certainly in the big parks there, and they're not bothered by people whatsoever. But obviously, you could say that of most wildlife in urban areas. They're generally more tame because they're used to human interaction. Let's look at some of these papers then and find out a little bit more about cormorants. Allegedly, cormorants are actually the most studied bird globally. So there is so much research out there, so it can be a little bit mind-boggling. But let's get into the first bit. Now, this is population size, because a lot of people are not entirely sure how many cormorants are here. So this is the Scottish Review from 2016. I do realise that this is nearly 8 years out of date, but it's the most recent one that we have. Now, this covers cormorants, goosander and red-breasted merganser. Now, I'm mainly leaving red-breasted merganser out of today. This is simply because there's little evidence that they're a problem in England. They're actually quite a rare bird in England, and it's a big deal if one turns up. There is a suggestion there may be an impact in parts of Scotland, but for the most part, red-breasted mergansers are not an issue in England and Wales. If you don't know what they are, they basically look like a goosander, but they're a little bit smaller, generally more of a coastal bird, but they will come inland as well. Now, the Scottish breeding population estimate is thought to be around 1,432 birds, with a winter explosion of 6,241. The entire breeding population of Britain is 1,565. So you can see Scotland has the bulk of that, with roughly 100 more in England and Wales. In the winter, that bolsters to 8,440. So there are a fair few mergansers, but not in huge numbers. Let me get to the other two. Now, if we talk about goosander, they are mainly affecting upland rivers in the north and west of England, many of which support migratory salmonids. So you do get goosander on lowland lakes in the winter, but they're only sticking around generally in upland areas. Certainly that's true for my local area. Don't really see goosanders in the summer, but we do get them in the winter. I'd have to go somewhere like the Peak District to go and see goosanders. So the Scottish breeding population is thought to be 1,991, great year, and that the British breeding population is 3,455. So again, Scotland has most of them, but we still do get them spread out. The British winter population, that then skyrockets to 11,870. So we definitely get a big influx of goosanders from continental Europe in the winter, and Scotland solely, that's around 5,296. So around about half of those are going to Scotland. Now, I have to admit, I've got a soft spot for goosanders. They are a beautiful bird, but they're very effective in what they do. I've seen underwater footage of goosander chasing salmon parr. They're not eating as big a fish as cormorants, but they can certainly shovel down fish in the region of a pound. Would be no problem for a goosander. Cormorants, what are we looking at for those? So for the Scottish breeding population estimate, that is around 3,626 birds. If you go for the British population estimate, that goes up to 8,355 birds. Now that doesn't seem like that many to me, but bearing in mind this is nearly 8 years ago, so I would imagine that this is a little bit out of date now. The winter for cormorants though really does bolster, so the winter population goes up to 35,415. So the vast majority of cormorants in the UK are coming in the winter to feed. So winter is a crucial time for fisheries to keep an eye out when cormorants are coming in, because there's going to be a lot more hungry mouths coming in the winter. Now, looking at a DEFRA report, they state damage caused by cormorants was generally considered to be problematic and an effect of a broader range of fishery types. Moreover, cormorants were concluded to have sublethal effects through wounding of fish, behavioural changes and loss of fish condition. It was also noted that this species presents a significant challenge in terms of attempting to quantify their use of sites due to their opportunistic foraging behaviour, resulting in complex patterns of movements in response to changes in prey availability or management activities. Essentially saying that if they heavily batter one lake, they'll just move to another and heavily batter that one. So they can have a huge effect and cover a large area, particularly when you've got lots of cormorants fishing together. They mentioned fish damage there as well, which is definitely something cormorants do. They have a serrated bill, which obviously birds don't have teeth, they've got a beak, but there are kind of almost barbs on it. So they'll grab fish, and once they've grabbed it, they very rarely let go. But cormorants are not very good at judging size, so often they'll grab fish that are far too big for them to eat. I remember watching a cormorant at Boston on the River Witham, and it went down and it caught a very large pike, tried to eat it, couldn't eat it, let it go, damaged the side of that pike. Every angler will have seen fish with cormorant damage on it as well. Quite often those fish will go on to get infections, it will affect breeding success and potentially kill the fish later down the line. That same cormorant that I saw on the Witham, it then went down and grabbed an eel, got it halfway down and wiggling out of its mouth, just couldn't get it down. So they're not the best judges of size when it comes to eating prey. But how much prey do they need per day? Well, the University of Hull also did a study, and they concluded that cormorants are piscivorous birds with a daily food intake of approximately 500 grams. Now, depending who you work for, some angling websites say it's up to £2, a pound. The point is they can live on about 500 grams, so that's a fair amount of fish, but maybe not as much as you'd suspect. I'm not saying they can't eat more, I'm just saying that's what they roughly need to keep going. Now, in the UK, the number of overwintering inland cormorants increased steadily between 1970 and 1987 at a rate of between 5 to 10% per annum. An increase of 74% occurred between the winter of 1987-88 and 1990-91. So it might come as no surprise that there has been a steady increase in birds. So we know they've increased and we know how they got here through harsh winters in the 60s, but why are they increasing? Well, think about it. They've come to an area where there's no predators or very few predators, there's lots of food and perfect habitat. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that this animal is going to do well. And you could argue that of any of the predators that we're talking about today. Now, a study by the BTO talks a little bit about the history of cormorants in the UK. So I'm going to read a bit of an extract. Great cormorants at Abberton Reservoir in Essex in 1981, the first inland breeding cormorant population in England. It's developed considerably through growth at Abberton and the establishment of new inland colonies. Up to 2005, cormorants have bred successfully in one or more years at 58 English sites that were not coastal cliffs or offshore islands, and so were defined as inland. Before 1981, the great cormorant in England rarely attempted to breed anywhere from coastal cliffs, stacks and offshore islands. This chapter charts the development of nesting at alternative sites termed inland, although a number are close to estuaries or open coastline. The first documented occurrence of inland tree nesting cormorants in England was in East Anglia in the 1540s. From this time until the 1940s, inland breeding was reported from 5 sites, comprising of 1 in Suffolk, 2 in Norfolk, 1 in Kent and 1 in Dorset and 1 in Cumbria. Birds that had their wings pinned were also known to have bred in St James Park, London. At several of these sites, persecution by humans is thought to have halted breeding activity. On the near continent, where the breeding race is predominantly Carbosinensis, population levels were kept low during the 19th and 20th centuries, and the distribution restricted, most likely through habitat loss and persecution. Throughout the 20th century, there were between 1,000 and 1,200 pairs in the Netherlands, around about 1,000 pairs in Denmark, and fewer than 400 pairs in Germany. In addition, pesticide contamination during the 1950s and 60s is thought to have reduced breeding success, causing a further decline in the continental population. Persecution in other parts of Europe is also thought to have reduced breeding numbers. For example, France had fewer than 60 pairs at the turn of the 19th century. Whilst the inland breeding cormorant population in the UK, predominantly of the continental race, has grown considerably since 1981, our long-established coastal breeding population of the nominate Carbo is believed to have remained relatively stable or to have declined in parts of its range. So I think that's an interesting point, that the coastal cormorants, which should be here, haven't increased in numbers, but the inland ones have. And as we mentioned, habitat is good, lots of food for them, but also they're not really being persecuted anymore, or not heavily, and there's no more DDT, which is affecting the eggs. So that's another reason why cormorants are rising in numbers. DEFRA in 2013 also did a review, and it concluded that while cormorants may cause a problem to specific fisheries, they do not cause a general problem, and there was no proof that killing was more effective at reducing numbers of cormorants than simply scaring them away. More recently, in 2022, Natural Resource Wales undertook a review of fish-eating birds' impact on salmonids and ultimately approved an action plan to help protect fish populations from the impact of predation by fish-eating birds. NRW board approved the action plan after careful consideration of the recommendations from the Fish-Eating Birds Advisory Group, that was a mouthful, on how vulnerable fisheries and fish stocks can be protected from predation pressure while continuing to conserve fish-eating birds. Acting on the advisory group's recommendations, here's the action plan. Explore the use of catchment-based licences for better coordination in control of fish-eating birds to help conserve vulnerable fish populations. Set thresholds for controls that ensure that long-term conservation status of bird populations. Facilitate and deliver targeted measures to protect at-risk and probably at-risk stocks at periods when they're most vulnerable, especially at known pinch points where smolts are most vulnerable. This will include measures such as improving river connectivity by removing barriers and improving downstream smolt migration, providing improved in-river habitat to provide cover for fish, and supporting non-lethal techniques to scare birds and protect. So before I finish on cormorants and move on to the next one, I'm just going to read one more study, which was a tagging exercise on continental Europe. So they tagged and released fish with a coded wire tags followed by intensive cormorant pellet sampling. Basically, they would tag fish, and then they go to these cormorant colonies and count how many tags they could find to try and get a rough estimate of how many fish these cormorants were eating. Sampling may be a viable method to measure the impact of cormorants on fish populations. To test this new method, the study tagged cormorant predation in a shallow estuary, where nearly 100,000 fish were tagged and more than 10,000 cormorant pellets were collected over a 3-year study period. A total of 112 tags were recovered from the collected pellets. Analysis of tag recovery data indicated considerable cormorant predation on tagged flounder, eel and salmon smolts. So not a huge return, but obviously the cormorants can shit anyway, so they're not necessarily going to get all the tags under there. But you would think if they tagged 100,000 fish that you get a few more than 112 tags back. So that was a small but interesting study. Overall, what can you do if there are cormorants on your fishery or your fishing club? Well, you can shoot them. You have to apply for a licence. You can't just go shooting them willy-nilly. Natural England grant a 3,000 bird licence per year, but that's for the entirety of England. So that's not one club shooting 3,000 birds. I think it's something like 4 birds, or so. It's very low. I should probably have checked that for this, so don't quote me on that. But a fishery is not allowed to shoot that many. It's pretty low. I know one of the things that some groups were campaigning for was to move cormorants to a general licence so they can be shot a little bit easier and more willy-nilly. But as of yet, you have to apply for a licence to shoot cormorants. However, you can try lots of non-lethal methods, and they are advised to be tried first. First and foremost, human presence. If it is a riverbank or a lake, having people there generally spooks cormorants off. They don't hang around too much. Obviously, cormorants get up early and they stay late, so it is quite intensive, and you can't have someone on the river or lake all the time, but lots of human presence generally spooks the cormorants off. I know people use scarecrows. They can work, but again, the cormorants will get used to them if you don't move them, change the outfits. You have to kind of do a little bit of that. One thing that's being trialled is bird of prey scarers, fake bird of prey, where people use them to kind of scare pigeons and gulls off their homes, but it's being trialled on rivers, and actually that's become quite successful. My local fishing club, we actually have string or rope across our course lake. We've got a small kind of match lake, if you like, so full of small fish. What this means is that the cormorants can't fly in clearly or out. It's incredibly primitive, but it seems to do the job. I mean, this lake is right next to the Trent and right next to bigger lakes that do get cormorants. We very rarely get cormorants on the small lake. Scare tactics definitely seem to work if they're kept up. The cormorants will just realise it's too much hassle to fish there and move on, although you could argue you're just shifting the problem elsewhere. I'm going to end on this article that was in Angling Times, written by my mate Dominic Garnett, who is a very good angler, and it's something that maybe anglers and wildlife fans can both agree on perhaps, and that is the reintroduction of sea eagles, white-tailed sea eagles, because what they're finding in Germany and Scandinavia's Baltic Sea is that the sea eagles are decimating cormorant colonies. So let me just read an extract from this. This is also from Finland's Environment Institute. Across Germany and Scandinavia's Baltic Sea, in particular, eagle numbers are not only increasing but putting claw marks in cormorant colonies. And while with many birds migrating south every winter to the UK waters, that could be good news for Britain's fish stocks in the long run. The white-tailed sea eagle can eat both cormorant eggs and offspring, and they also steal fish caught by cormorants. In addition, the eagles scare adult cormorants from their nest, exposing eggs and offspring to predatory gulls and crows, said a representative from the Finnish authorities. Situations have been observed in both Finland and Germany where there are up to 30 white-tailed eagles in a great cormorant colony at a time. They continued, adding that the predation and harassment caused by the white-tailed eagle can sometimes be so severe that the colony does not produce any offspring in that summer, and that in at least one case, continuous predation has led to the end of a breeding colony of 2,000 nests. With so many of the cormorants at UK fisheries arriving as migrants from Northern Europe each winter, it's hoped that this could have a positive impact on the hardest hit venues and species like roach, bream and trout. In Finland, the cormorant population has not only stopped growing, but declined since 2015, suggesting the return of top-level predators could be a possible solution to one of angling's longest-running battles, not to mention less continuous than culls. Now, it should be noted that we do have sea eagles already in the UK, particularly around Scotland, and it's interesting that there aren't as many cormorants in Scotland as there are in lowland England, although you could argue that's because we've got better habitat in lowland England. Sea eagles have just been reintroduced to the south coast on the Isle of Wight, and the hope is that they will breed and spread along our coastline. So it could very well be that sea eagles are the angler's dream in terms of naturally controlling cormorants. They hunt them at all times of the day, so you haven't got to get up early to scare them, and it costs less than a shotgun pellet. So I would definitely welcome white-tailed sea eagles to munch on a few cormorants. I think that would be wonderful to see natural predation on these animals. I've banged on enough about cormorants anyway. Let's move on to my first guest. This is Mark Owen, Head of Fisheries at the Angling Trust, and we talk a little bit about cormorants and otters and what anglers can do if they're affecting their fishery. Well, welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thanks, Jack.
Do you want to say who you are and who the Angling Trust are?
Yeah, I'm Mark Owen. I'm Head of Fisheries at the Angling Trust. The Angling Trust is a membership organisation for anglers, recreational anglers, whether that's sea, game or coarse. And we're recognised by Sport England as the national governing body.
So, obviously, it's a very kind of complex issue, predation, and it's not black and white. That's why I'm trying to get lots of different viewpoints on it, and I was very keen to get the Angling Trust on to talk about bits and bobs. So I think the first thing to start with is, how does it affect the income of fisheries? Because it's all easy, I guess, for people who don't realise that predation can have a financial impact on fishing clubs and fishery owners.
It does, and we see that. And one of the things that we do with the Environment Agency is give out grants to fisheries to protect their fisheries.
Okay.
And one of the evidence requirements that we look at before giving a grant is that income and the decrease in numbers. It can make fishing clubs completely unviable financially, anglers will walk away. It's not just a lack of fish during predation, but of course a lot of fish will be heavily marked and scarred from predation, and it from an angler, a paying angler point of view who wants to fish, that isn't something that they're really looking for.
They want pristine fish ideally, and not scarred up fish from cormorants or whatnot. So what kind of, you mentioned grants there with the EA and yourself, so what would those grants be used for?
We do, it's called the Angling Improvement Fund. It's funded by rod licence income, so anglers are paying for this, and it is for methods to decrease the impact of predation. So I've just actually yesterday finished scoring the latest round of this.
Okay.
A lot of applications, and it varies from otter fencing, and that is your standard wire mesh fencing to keep otters out, to where that's not possible, because it's not always possible, it can be electric fencing, and also for cormorants, and also for otters as well. Things like improving refuges within the water, so that fish can hide away and not be easily caught, and that can be floating islands planted up, which can be very nice looking, to actually making part of a lake as much as you can predator free by using like chestnut saplings in the water, so that fish can get through and into a sanctuary, but a predator can't follow.
I'm with you. I think that's a really interesting point, because if you've got should we just say a lake, for example, and there's nowhere for the fish to go to hide from predators, then it's open season, isn't it, for whatever's going to get in there and eat them. So if you do add, whether it's reed beds or the saplings that you mentioned, or these fish refuges, that at the very least is going to stagger that predation, isn't it? And hopefully they can bugger off somewhere else and not hit one fishery too hard.
That's right. Overhanging branches from trees, things like that just make it difficult for a predator's is really looking for an easy life. They don't really want to spend an awful lot of energy looking for a prey. So the more difficult you can make it, then the more likely that predator, whatever it is, will try and find an easier meal somewhere else.
It's interesting you say that, because I was at Attenborough Nature Reserve recently, and they've got around the visitor centre, they've got like a cage. I think it's to stop birds getting at the reed beds, but it's probably wasn't there for fish originally, but all the small fish fry have gone in there, and it's interesting. You'll see like grebes and other fish-eating birds around the edge, and they want to try and get in, but they can't. There'll just be masses of small roach and gudgeon, because they know that's a safe place to get away, and at least gives them half a chance to spread out when they can.
That's exactly that, Jack.
Yeah. Have you? Because obviously we're at the one of the offices for the Angling Trust today, and you based, is it Staffordshire? Where are you? You're locally, aren't you?
Personally, in South Derbyshire.
So have you noticed it locally? Like, do you think there's been an increase in predators on the Trent catchment? One of the other hats that you wear, of course, is Trent Rivers Trust as well, isn't it? So do you think there's been an increase in cormorants and otters on the Trent catchment?
I think I think if you go back in time, Jack, if you go back to, and it's quite marked, particularly cormorant populations across its range, whether this is North America or Europe, what you'll see is the increase is very definitely correlated with the banning of DDT.
Yeah.
That's when you start seeing that increase in populations.
So that affects cormorants. I know it affected otter breeding success. It affects cormorants as well, did it?
Yeah.
Okay, didn't know that.
Yeah. So it was that ban, and look across the range, not just individual countries. I'm a big believer in looking at natural range as opposed to just geographical boundaries.
Yeah.
You will see that.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can take one place in the UK in isolation. Say, has it increased there? It's increased across the board.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I was talking to a fisheries scientist recently who started work on the River Trent in the 70s, and he saw otters regularly then.
Right. Okay.
So, and we've seen from otter surveys, and what we see from cormorants is, yes, they're established everywhere now. I don't think there's any you can point to any part of the certainly England and Wales, where otters haven't come back. And the thing about cormorants is different because we get the large numbers of cormorants coming over here in the winter. So they're migrating from breeding grounds in Europe, mostly the Baltic area. And then as it gets cold in that area, they migrate. And some move over here, some move down to southern Europe, some move down to southeast Europe. So there's that migration that you have to take into account with cormorants as well.
So you're always going to get more in the winter, regardless of what you've got in the summer.
As a generalised rule, what you'll find is that if you've got a very cold winter in Europe, we will get more cormorants coming here. If we have a very cold winter and Europe has a warm winter, we get less and more moving into Europe.
Right. Okay. That makes
very much. That's a
I know. As a rule of thumb, sort of thing. That makes complete sense. The only reason I ask, I'm just trying to think, because obviously I grew up in Nottinghamshire, and I remember seeing cormorants, but I don't remember seeing as many as I do now. But maybe I notice it more now. It's hard to. You have to be so careful with anecdotal evidence, don't you? Because obviously it's easy to go, well, when I was a lad and I saw that. So
it is. The Trent. You also have to look at how they migrate and where they migrate through. So from Europe, they will be using the Trent Gateway,
right,
to move in and then spread out. So you get the Trent, the Thames. You've got the other rivers. They'll use those as migratory corridors, which makes sense for a bird like cormorant.
Yeah, because I think I'm right in saying. Well, you mentioned it. Then it's Carbosinensis, isn't it? It's that Baltic cormorant that. They do eat a lot of coarse fish. It's not the marine. I think there are a few marine ones, but overwhelmingly it's this Baltic cormorant, isn't it? That
Carbosinensis, as you said, is the one that's really increased in numbers.
Yeah.
Carbo, which is the sort of coastal one that you're referring to.
Yeah.
It starts getting complicated when you start trying to define the species, because actually what we found now is the two have interbred.
Oh, right, okay.
So I'm not quite sure what we call the offspring scientifically.
Mongrels.
But yes, no, that they are. It's established now that they've crossbred. So.
Right, okay. Because I know one of the long-standing myths among a lot of anglers is that cormorants come inland because there's no fish left in the sea. When it's not really, as far as I'm aware, that's more of a myth, or maybe I'm wrong.
I can't disprove that or prove that.
Okay,
the only thing that I will say that we have observed is that with the coastal birds, if you get a big storm at sea, it pushes them inland.
Oh, okay.
So and that's quite that's been noticed by the angling community quite a lot. In the fact they'll suddenly realise and that we're having a big storm out in the Channel or in the North Sea or whatever. We know that the coastal birds will move inland to get out of that, and sometimes they will stay.
Yeah, I guess if they think, well, the food's good and the habitat's good, why am I going back out?
That's right. Cormorants eat fish. They're not really perturbed whether it's a coastal fish or a chub.
They're definitely not fussy. So what's the current law then on controlling them? Because as far as I'm aware, there's a limited license granted as that people can apply to control some?
You can. The UK government applies a derogation of the Birds Directive, which we are still subject to,
right.
To protect fisheries, which is quite accepted across Europe. There are circumstances where damage has to be controlled.
Yeah.
And but you have to go through hoops to get that license. So you have to prove that there is damage and that significant damage is taking place.
Yeah.
And you have to do counts. You apply for a license. We will help you do that as much as we can and point you in the right direction as to what is required.
Yeah.
And then your license, then, if Natural England agree it, to control a certain number of birds lethally.
Because it's I don't know if it changes year on year, but it's a set number each year. Is that right? Like you say.
So this was brought in actually by the last Labour government.
Right.
So under the present policy, it's not legislation; it's policy.
Yeah.
In England, you can lethally control up to 2,000 birds per annum, exceptionally up to 3,000.
Right. So I'm doing some quick maths. I think, is it something like 60,000 breeding?
That's UK.
The UK. Okay. So 2,000 is not a lot, is it? When you think about how many there are, and I know the subject of lethal control of any animal is often met with controversy and advertisement, but arguably 2,000's presumably not doing a great deal of difference if you.
It depends how it's used. So the government policy on this, and the angling community has a different view on when we talk about this. It's called shooting to kill to scare.
Right.
So the idea is that if 5 cormorants fly into your fishery, you don't shoot all 5. You shoot one of them, and that will deter the others from coming in and not come back to that fishery. Right.
So they'll learn we don't want to go back there because we're not going to fly out.
That's why it's called shooting to kill to scare.
Right. Okay. And that works. Like that's been proven, has it? That
it does work.
Yeah.
What you tend to find, and what I didn't stress as well, is that before you take lethal control, you have to have taken all possible non-lethal methods to deter the birds from coming in. So what we tend to find is it requires a mix of methods. Cormorants are very intelligent. They get very habituated to one particular technique. So I will quite often see, fishers will say, we walk round with a dog the lake or down the river, and we've always used that to deter the cormorants, and all of a sudden it's not working. Well, that's because they've got used to the fact that you and your dog aren't a threat to them.
Yeah.
So it requires a mix, which is very labour intensive for the angling, particularly when we're talking largely volunteers here. It's very labour intensive. And
I guess as well, like early starts, late starts, cormorants don't work 9 to 5, do they? So if you're not out there first thing, they're just going to munch the fish when.
It is. It's first light and last light. And some of the techniques that we use for non-lethal deterrence require that. I mean, we use lasers quite a lot.
Lasers? Okay, how's that work?
So, and I will stress that you need to be properly trained on this. It's not something you just go into a shop and buy a laser and use.
No.
And we will, our staff will go through this with you. And it is, we use a green light, because that is what we found is that is the one that disturbs the cormorant the most.
Right.
And this is about putting the laser on the shoulder or the body so the cormorant can see it. This disturbs them. This is a technique that is used in agriculture for geese, for example.
Right. Okay.
And for various others. It means that you're very specific. You're not making big bangs and disturbing local people or local wildlife or anything. It can be done very, very specifically. So all you're doing is deterring the cormorant from doing it. But you have to do that first light or last light. It's not much good during the middle of the day
because it's too much light. Presumably. Yeah. I saw literally yesterday. I saw the Ness Salmon Fishery Board. I think someone up there. They were using those fake birds of prey. Farmers sometimes use them where you can They're like a kite that fly.
Yeah, we use them.
Yeah, and apparently that's quite a successful tool as well. So
as long as you mix it up, again, if you just try and rely on one deterrent on its own,
yeah,
the bird or whatever you're wanting to scare off,
yes, yeah,
will get used to that and suddenly realise it's not a threat to them.
So you just have to keep switching it up, and then as a last resort, that's when lethal control potentially comes in if nothing else is working, and then
and it comes back to the fact that it's fully recognised that fisheries have a commercial value. Fish have a value. It is to protect fisheries, the same as the derogation that's in the directives is there to protect agriculture.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing.
Well, I mean, I suppose you look at, say, salmon smolts, for example. I mean, salmon are in a crisis, arguably, in the UK, and there's a very, very real risk that we may, even lose salmon, which is terrible. So you think that all these small smolts coming down the river into the estuary, which off the top of my head is like April, May time, that sort of time it happens. So that would be a key time to protect the river. And even if a cormorant or gooseander or whatever eats a dozen, that's still a dozen salmon that potentially
we are in that situation, unfortunately, now. It's something that we're working very closely on and with partners, in the fact that we're getting to a stage with the Atlantic salmon where we might not have any left. It could be, certainly in my lifetime, we could well be having rivers that are extinct of salmon in this country.
Yeah, it's dreadful.
So when you get predation on a population that is fragile anyway and threatened with extinction, then the more predation that happens, even though in an ideal world it would be natural, the more predation you get on that, the more impact it's going to have at a population level.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that we have with our rivers is that we have, frankly, buggered them up such a lot.
Putting it lightly, Mark. Yeah.
We have weirs on them and all the rest of it. So you mentioned smolts. What we find is that smolts will actually not be very happy crossing that weir going downstream. They will hold upstream until they're used to it, and that then becomes a honeypot for predation. Yeah. If the weir wasn't there, we wouldn't have that problem. So where man has made pinch points and has impacted on fish migration, those are the points that we need to ensure they're protected.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think it's worth saying, and I'll repeat it constantly through this podcast, that predation is an issue. In my humble opinion, it's not the issue, but there are other issues that exaggerate predation. So you mentioned barriers to migration, which makes predation a bigger issue, lack of habitat, which makes predation a bigger issue, and water quality, which makes it a bigger issue. I think the thing with anglers, and I was talking to this with Dave Webb earlier, predation's a motive, because you see that fantastic barbel carcass, or you see a cormorant eating a roach. You can imagine as an angler that's going to make your heart sink, whereas you might not see those smolt held up above the weir or those other problems coming in.
That's right. I think government are starting to recognise that. I worked with Welsh Government on this last year, and changes are coming. And I think we launched our Salmon Manifesto in January in the House of Commons, and the Fisheries Minister was there, and we're having follow-up discussions on that. And we campaign hugely on pollution, whether it's agricultural pollution, water company pollution. Our close company we closely work with, Fish Legal, regularly takes them to court and does a fantastic job. So it's a range of issues. Once you've got fish populations, any animal population if you like, at a fragile state, then any external factors that may well be mitigated by large numbers then becomes an even more important factor.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right, and the work the Angling Trust have been doing recently has been fantastic. I mean, they're popping up all over the news. I see them on social media regularly, and they're fighting really at the forefront for pollution. So I think it's great what you guys are doing. But yeah, thanks for coming on, Mark.
Thanks, Jack. Pleasure as always.
That was Mark Owen from the Angling Trust. Some really interesting points there. Now, if you'd like to join the Angling Trust or find out more about them, you can visit their website or the link in the description. Now let's take a look at otters. My next guest is Dave Webb from the UK Wild Otter Trust, as we talk about otters, the conflict with anglers, and really get into the nitty-gritty of it. Here's our chat. So welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Cheers, thanks very much, Jack. Appreciate you asking me.
No problem. Shall we start with who you are then and who the Otter Trust are for people who don't know?
Yeah, so my name's Dave Webb. I'm the founder of the UK Wild Otter Trust. We, as an organisation, do lots of work with angling, various angling outlets, fraternities, clubs, groups, lakes, waters, stuff like that. We work with the Angling Trust, and we obviously part of our core work as well is the rehabilitation of orphaned or injured, sick otter cubs and adults, obviously. So, yeah, a variety of work.
And you're down in Devon, aren't you? That's right.
Yeah, we are. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we're in North Devon. Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning with otters then. Why did otters originally decline in the UK? Because obviously they've always been here, and then there was a sudden drop, and then they've come back, which is one of the big success stories for a lot of people in UK wildlife. But why did they originally decline?
So originally it was to do with the organic chlorines that were being pumped into the rivers, pesticides and stuff like that. The organic chlorines particularly were an issue because there was a thing in there called deldrin, and that affected the reproductive systems, particularly in the females. So while the males were probably doing a dirty deed, the females actually weren't being able to carry forward. So even though they potentially thought they were breeding, they clearly weren't, and the reproduction systems took a bit of a hammering for that, and then that obviously caused a decline of sorts. Luckily, it didn't make them completely extinct, but there was a concern at that time that obviously there was going to be a major problem with the population. So that's obviously why that was then banned, and then obviously they just continued on as they once they got over it, they just continued as they were, and the populations that we see today is a result of that very thing being banned.
So is that the same as DDT? Is that just the kind of abbreviation for
it?
Okay.
Yes, it is. Yeah,
that's the one that I've heard of.
Yeah,
and it's interesting that you say there that they didn't completely go, because I think this is where one of the misconceptions come, that people talk about the reintroduction of otters, but that's not really the right term, because they never completely went, did they?
No, that's right. It's a conversation I have many times with many anglers, and if you go on the dreaded Facebook, you very often come across groups, well, they should never been reintroduced. They never have been reintroduced because they were never extinct.
No.
It may be a case of just playing on words, but actually they were never extinct, so it is not a reintroduction. What the original Otter Trust did, and another misconception is that people get very confused with us being the UK Wild Otter Trust and the original Otter Trust, so we get blamed for the reintroduction or for the
releases,
captive breeding program, when actually it's nothing to do with us. We're a completely separate organisation. But yeah, people do get confused with that, and people think they were reintroduced and think they were extinct, but they weren't.
Because they sort of hung on in the southwest a little bit, didn't they? In Wales, Scotland. I think so. I'm based in the Midlands, so I think we pretty much lost them, and I know the southeast pretty much lost them. But presumably, it's hard to find data on where releases have happened and haven't. But some of that will be releases, I'm sure. But a lot of it was just recolonization of their own steam.
Yeah, it was. Obviously, a lot of the information is quite sketchy. Certainly, as you say, the southwest, parts of Wales, particularly West Wales and Scotland around the coasts, they've always been a stronghold, and the releases, I think from memory, there's quite a few done around sort of the Thames catchment and Yorkshire area. There is some data out there that can be found, fairly easily on the internet. But yeah, there were certain areas that, I think there was some around the Cotswolds as well. But those sort of areas, but pretty much, I think what they did back then, they did some surveys, and that's Sprague surveys. I'm not a big fan of Sprague surveys because it actually doesn't tell you anything other than an otter's been there. It doesn't serve any any use in population levels and stuff like that.
Right.
And just because you don't find Sprague doesn't mean an otter's not using that territory. It just means it actually isn't there and it hasn't, had a poo there. So it's all a little bit sketchy. But no, you're absolutely right when you say, there were some areas that had some put back into that they thought there was none or very low. And yes, there's been strong odors around in various parts of the country.
So when you say that you're doing releases, that's when it's like animals that have been taken in from the wild already. It's not captive breeding, is it? It's more like if an
No,
otter
no,
you
no.
injured or whatnot, you're
Yeah, yeah,
rehabilitating it.
yeah. But it's not a breeding program. It's a rehabilitation program. So it's two very, very different things. As I say, we will take cubs, that are very small. The smallest we've had is something like 450 grams in weight. And we've taken otters that are 6-7 kilos in weight. So the younger ones obviously need a full year's worth of or more of rehabilitation to get them through the process because of the time they spend with the mother, which is a very long time. And the older ones that come in may only need a week, 2 weeks, a bit of TLC just to see what they're doing, monitor them, make sure they're fit for use, check them, and then get them out.
Yeah. So what do you release them back where you find them, or like I guess it makes most sense to put them where you got them from, I would imagine.
Well, yeah, more often, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the time, they will go back as close as possible. Sometimes logistically, and for various reasons, such as it might not be safe. For example, if you find one in a city centre,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
it's not logical to put it back there, obviously, for
No,
obvious reasons.
no.
So yeah, we choose to release such very carefully, and because of the way the otter's behaviour has evolved over the years, obviously the rehab side of things have changed drastically. So we gear our releases around each otter's need. So if we have, quite often we'll pair them up. They come in singly, but if we pair them up because it's better for them because more confidence, easier for us. And sometimes we'll put three together. So we will be guided by their behavior because they'll all gel to each other because they possibly had siblings before they were split up. So we will then gear that behavior towards specific release sites. Everything we do is geared towards the best for the otters.
Yeah. And what's the diet made up of? Because I guess most people just assume fish, but they eat other things.
They do, yeah. I mean, the primarily the diet is probably 75-80% fish based, so that can be a variety of fish. But they will take obviously eggs, small mammals, birds, crayfish, which is a good thing. I've known them eat fruit, so they have an extremely varied prey.
I didn't know they were omnivorous, so they'll actually take fruit, will they?
Yeah, they have. Yeah, I mean, quite sometimes we'll include some fruit, apples, melon, stuff like that in the diet of the ones we have here. Primarily, we feed them trout and day-old chicks, but sometimes we'll give them, some sort of fibre of some sort, carrots, thing like that sort of thing. Don't get it every day, but they do get it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose not a massive surprise, I guess, is it with other mustelids are
Yeah,
omnivorous, aren't they? So it's not a
yeah.
huge shock, I guess. So when you, I mean, I guess because you must get the brunt of a lot of kind of criticism from certain anglers. So where do you think the conflict comes in when it's people seeing otters take fish? Like what's the issue in your eyes, or maybe no issue? Like what do you think is the take on it?
But yeah, yeah, we do get a lot of flack from anglers. 95% of the anglers are good guys. You will always get a minority that won't believe a word you say. Some I could say, actually, otters will eat your fish, and they'll say, otters don't eat fish, but because I said it, or because the organisation said it, and that has actually happened. And it's no good. I get the frustration. Believe me, we do. I'm an angler. I've been an angler all my life. It's just I've ended up running a rehab centre and an otter trust. So I get the frustration, but killing them, culling and trying to cull them, doing things illegal isn't the way forward. They're saying they're eating everything. Otters will never, ever void a specific area of everything that's in there, i.e. fish or river. People say to me, well, they've eaten every fish in the river. They won't. It's a bit like you and me, eating all the food we've got in our fridge in one binge hit, not having anything. We're not going to do that. So the way forward, rivers, very, very difficult. You cannot fence rivers. It's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult to stop predation on rivers. Having said that, the riparian habitats are the natural habitats for that species. And the problem comes more so when they leave the rivers. So when they're in flood or for whatever reason they move, building, habitat loss, it's all they were doing. These animals get pushed out. They move it, inland. They come across garden ponds that are, unprotected. They come across fisheries that are unprotected, and they go in and they make a feast. And particularly when they got young, the female will take a cub or a couple of cubs to a lake, because it's easy to teach them to hunt in a lake than it is into a river, fast flowing or even slow river environment. It's a lot easier. But the only way forward to get rid of that frustration is talk to people and try and get an understanding of the otter's behaviour. There's a lot of people out there that don't understand the behaviour of the otter, why it's doing what it's doing and how it's doing it, and they want to get rid of it immediately, and it's not the answer. They need to spend time listening to people to get that information. Simple as that.
And that's some. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning you've been working with the Angling Trust, so you're more than happy to kind of advise fisheries and fishing clubs and whatnot. They can get in touch and see if there's
all the time. We've done it a lot. This forms a massive part of what we do. We try and visit as many fisheries as logistically possible. We will speak to everybody. We will answer the calls. We will help with fencing. We'll advise on fencing. We'll put them in touch with the Angling Trust, who give grants via the Environment Agency. I think that's about 150,000 a year at the moment, which is not a lot of money in the bigger scale of things, but it's better than nothing. Yeah. So people can get grants, I think, of about 5k to help them fence. And they don't need to spend tens and tens of thousands of pounds for an otter fence. This can be done a lot cheaper, and we will always help people and advise people. The simplest, the easiest, the cheapest way to do it, but hopefully an effective way. It's all about the effectiveness of what they're putting up as opposed to the cost of it. Because you pay 60 grand for a fence doesn't mean to say it's going to keep an otter out.
No.
A 10 grand fence would have the same effect. So why spend 60 when you can do it for 10? So is that just trying to raise that awareness and stuff like that? Obviously, we have UCOT have a license from Natural England to humanely trap problematic otter that happens to be inside the fence, because obviously once it gets inside, if it can't get out, fishery owners didn't, before we got that license, have any legal humane option to remove it. Now they have. They can call us, we can go out, we can assess it, we can trap it, we can get it out, albeit it's released to the immediate outside perimeter of the fence, because you can't trap it, put it in a car and drive it 20 miles because you're disrupting the territories. And we don't charge for that at all. We've deployed traps. Probably we've had 3,000 calls since we've got the license. And we've only ever had to deploy 9 traps live set, and we've caught 7 otters. The other 2 got out by other means. So it's effective. We don't charge a penny, no matter where it's to in the country. We don't charge for doing that because we want to help. We want to have an input in helping those fisheries to be successful.
What controls otter numbers naturally then? I mean, obviously, I see a lot of things online about, well, there's nothing to eat otters. But I mean, as far as I'm aware, there's not a lot that would eat otters anyway. So what would control the numbers for otters when they're at a point where they're kind of peak numbers, if you like?
Well, they've got no natural predators. And it's, I don't believe for a minute at the moment they're not. There isn't a balance. Balance hasn't been reached, and between prey, predators, predator, prey, and until that does happen, once that happens, then those numbers will naturally level off. Yeah, and it will get to a point where everything is sustained and everything goes fine. Yes, in the meantime, things are going to get predated, but they're an apex predator. It's what they do. It's nature, sadly. And if you're investing thousands and thousands of pounds into a fishery, a still water fishery, for example, you have to make, fencing and protecting that asset as a priority as part of the business plan, rather than seeing it as an expensive option that you don't think you should have to do.
Yeah. No, it's because I guess with a lake, I mean, nothing simple in life, is it? But if you have a lake, you get a
No, no.
fence up. You get a fence
Yeah,
up, and for the most part, that's a pretty effective way of keeping them out. But if you run a river
yeah.
fishery or just a river, that's a different story, and it's a lot trickier because, as you say, arguably the
Yeah.
otters, that's where they live. You can't keep them out the river, can you?
No, no, you can't. It's a problem. The rivers are a problem. It's, there is very little that you can do to persuade them from that. It is their natural habitat. Sadly, the only people that we're able to help at the moment, because of the nature of the beast, is still fisheries. Sadly,
Yeah.
we wish we could help people with rivers, but the bottom line is the otters can have a territory up to 20 miles. That's a big area. Sadly, things can get predated.
Yeah, because I do feel for some of them when it's a livelihood
Mm,
that they're depending on, and you know, as you say, predators they got to eat, but it can affect people's jobs in that way. I mean,
yeah,
my thoughts are predation is such a thorny issue, which is one of the reasons why I've avoided it for so
yeah,
many years. But my
yeah,
my thoughts on it are that it is a problem. I don't think it should be ignored, but I feel like it's a symptom of bigger problems like habitat degradation, pollution, and barriers to migration with fish.
mm,
And then
yeah,
predation adds to those weights already. Whereas if we sorted out pollution on rivers, if we had
yeah,
free reign
yeah.
on migration of fish and more habitat,
Hmm.
you wouldn't feel the pinch as much with things eating them.
You wouldn't know. You're absolutely spot on. It's a conversation. Again, I have this conversation. People, some of the very anti-otter groups out there, and they do exist. So you've got to get rid of the otters. You've got to get rid of the otters. Well, actually, the otters can, taking into account everything you've just mentioned, are far more of a risk than the otters are. The otters coming along, you've got all these issues that you've just mentioned. There was this agricultural runoff, less than 10 miles from me in one of the rivers down here, a few years back now, not that long ago. And he did get fined heavily, but that's not a lot of good when the runoffs killed probably 30,000 fish.
Yeah.
Fining them 100,000 quid or whatever it was they got fined doesn't touch it, doesn't scratch the surface, and money can never repair that damage. And the problem is when that happens, and again, habitat loss. Everybody now wants to building infrastructure. People want to live next to rivers. Builders want to build next to rivers. It all has a knock-on effect. It's pushing the otters out. They're not going to stay around in the middle of a housing estate, even if that's where their halt is. They're going to move out. They're going to move out. It will move closer to fisheries, and then of course from their guys' perspective on the rivers, you've got all these issues, and then suddenly an otter comes along, and that's the icing on the cake.
Yeah.
But sadly, they spend a lot of time worrying about the otter instead of trying to sort out all the issues below the otter, below that apex predator that's actually causing the apex predator to be the icing on the cake, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I think what it's often a case of is that you can see the damage, or inverted commas, that
Mm,
an otter does because you might find a barbel on the bank with its throat ripped out. And as an angler,
yeah.
that's a motive. You see that and you think, oh my God, that was a beautiful double figure barbel, and an otter's had
Mm-hmm.
that, and that's upsetting. Whereas
Mm,
the things that I mentioned, pollution, habitat degradation, barriers to migration, they're a death by a thousand cuts. They take a long time to kill fish and to lower fish numbers. So you don't get
mm-hmm.
as angry about that because it takes longer to be an issue.
Yeah.
Whereas a predator, you can physically watch that predator eat a fish. So you've seen that fish go
Mm-hmm.
before your eyes. So I understand why people get annoyed with it because you're seeing it happen, but there's bigger problems, I would say. And if half the people who
Yeah.
complain about predation put that energy into
Yeah.
campaigning against sewage or whatever, which
Mm-hmm.
which anglers are, give them the credit. There are more anglers talking
Yeah, they
about
are
it now.
starting. Yeah,
I think we get a lot more done.
we would. Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think sometimes you can spend too much time worrying about the, not the sole cause. We get lots of pictures through, in particular about barbel, and I know it's an emotive subject with barbel anglers and with carp anglers. Very often, people don't actually see the otter kill the fish. Now, I'm not saying they don't kill them. Of course, they do,
Hmm.
but they don't kill everyone that they find. Some of that could be scavenging. if they come along and they find a dead barbel on the bank for oxygen loss, whatever reason it's dead,
Yeah.
they're going to scavenge it and they'll still eat it the same way. They'll still leave those telltale signs in the throat area. Just because it's dead doesn't mean to say they're going to eat differently, because that's where all the nutritious protein parts are. It's that's how they do it. That's how they eat. So a lot of the time, there isn't a huge amount of evidence to say that the otter has killed that fish.
Yeah.
Although I totally accept and understand that sometimes that is the case. Of course it is. And something like the barbel, for example, which the barbel anglers can sometimes be quite emotive about it. Actually, if you look back over the historic records over the past sort of 3, 4, 5, 6 years, every single year, the barbel weight record gets broken on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Now they're saying that their take is the otters have killed all the big fish, they're taking all the big fish, but they're still going. These people are still going fishing for this particular species, and every year the record gets broken. So clearly, what they're saying is not 100% right. Yes, I get there's a degree of truth in everything they say, but if they wiped everything out like they say they do, and completely just made a complete mess of every single barbel river, this wouldn't be happening. You wouldn't be seeing records broken. You wouldn't be seeing those big fish being caught. I think a lot of the fish, particularly barbel, learn when they're smaller. They grow up with otters around, with that predator, particularly that one particular predator.
Yeah.
And I think they learn over a period of time to actually think, oh shit, there's one coming, let's go. And I think they learn to live with them, and that's why I think they survive and why they end up breaking those records.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, because I live on the Trent, which is probably the best barbel river in the UK.
Yeah.
And we do get otters on the Trent as well. And I think the reason that barbel and otters coexist fairly well on the Trent is the Trent's a big river. It's a big, deep river. So big barbel can get away from otters pretty happily on the Trent. The smaller rivers, I mean, let's say historically, like the Wensum in Norfolk, for example, that was a big barbel river. It's harder for, say, a 15-pound barbel. It's not got that much room to get out of the way, away from a predator. So I think historically, where there were big barbel in smaller rivers, the average weight size, likely, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I'm just sort of speaking from sense here. But the average numbers of big fish on small rivers, I would think, has probably gone down. That's not to say they've all the fish gone. Just bigger fish are probably gone from smaller rivers. But when you look at the Severn, the Thames, the Trent, those big rivers, the barbel is still doing pretty well on there and coexisting with otters, because there's room to get away. Like you say, either the fish gets out of the way of the otter or it gets eaten. It's simple, really. So they gotta do it. Well, I'll leave you one last question before we finish up, which is, do you think that anglers and otters can coexist? Sing Kumbaya by the fireplace, maybe?
I think they already are. As I said before,
that's a good way
95% of them are absolutely, they're the custodians of the river. They see everything that's going on, and I could probably name on one hand the number of people that don't enjoy seeing an otter on a river. I get so many calls from anglers saying, I sat there fishing, I caught this fish, I didn't catch bugger all, and I saw an otter. That made the day. Most people are accepting of them. I think they are already coexisting with each other. And yes, there's always going to be a minority that will never want to coexist, with anything, no matter what. If it eats a fish, they're not going to want to coexist with it. So it's not just about otters; it's about all sorts.
No.
I think they will. I think they do, and I think as things, as awareness grows about both about fishing and about otters, predators, yes, I think that coexistence can only improve.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. If people want to find out more about the trust, where's the best place to go?
Probably the website, which is www.ukwildottertrust.org. There's lots of information on there. There's information on there about fencing as well for fisheries. So there is a fishery section on there. So there's a bit on there that can help. There's a bit about garden pond predation, and then there's bits on there obviously about us and about rehab and what we do. We try and be open and transparent in what we do. Most of it is on the website, so ping over and have a look.
Fabulous. I'll put a link to it in the description. But thanks for coming on, Dave.
That's all right. No worries, Jack. Thanks very much indeed.
That was Dave Webb from the UK Wild Otter Trust. Now, I just want to add on one more study about otters before we wrap this up. Now, the University of Cardiff did a study from 1994 to 2010 where they examined 610 otters' stomach contents. So essentially they get brought roadkill otters or otters that have been found dead, and what they wanted to establish was what exactly they're eating and try and get into the bottom of it. So 610 otters, what did they find? Well, on this particular study, 70% of the diet was fish, which is not a particular surprise. 14% was amphibians, so amphibians make up a pretty good proportion as well. The remaining percentages were insect, mammal, bird and crustaceans, although not very common. What the study was finding, though, is that of those fish, where eels were abundant, they would make up the majority of the food, which is really interesting because I've heard anecdotally, this is one of those things, again, people sort of pout around, that otters like to eat eels, they specialise in eels, and because of the decline in eels, as I'm sure if you don't already know, eels have declined by 95%, or around that figure, it seems to change depending who you ask, over the last 50, 60 years. So if you think about eels would have been incredibly common, that's a big food source, and if otters were mainly focusing on eels, they wouldn't have been touching other fish species quite as much. So you take away the eels, what are the otters going to eat? So it's an interesting thing. I don't know if there's been any studies into it. I think it would be good to kind of peel that open a little bit more, because there are rivers that still have a relatively good number of eels. So whether they do make up the large proportion of otters everywhere, I don't know. But it's an interesting thing to point out. The other thing that it said is that otters had then gone on to eating things like bullheads and sticklebacks, which had increased, but it was unlikely to compensate for the loss of eels. So they were eating more small fish to kind of try and compensate for the eels, but it wasn't quite filling the gap. So the nitty-gritty of that study was that yes, otters do eat some fish species that are of interest to anglers. However, the predominant prey are smaller fish such as stickleback and bullhead, which are not particularly valued by anglers. So I thought that was an interesting one. Now again, you can't say that for the entire country, but if you think that study had gone on for well over 20, nearly 20 years with 600 odd otters, it gives you a good idea, doesn't it? Well, we're coming to the end of this podcast. It's actually the first podcast I've done that's over an hour. I always try and make sure they're under an hour, but this is such a complex, thorny issue that I thought this is probably deserving of over the hour mark. So to summarise, otters. If you've got a still water fishery, get an otter fence. If you think there's a risk of otters, get an otter fence. They look horrible, I know they do, they're ugly, and they stop other mammals coming in and whatnot, but they work. My local fishery does have an otter fence, and actually it's meant that ground nesting birds have done really, really well, because it doesn't only keep otters out, it keeps things like foxes and badgers. So it has turned into like a mini wildlife oasis. Interestingly, oyster catchers, which not something I associate with Nottinghamshire, do really well inside of the otter fence. When it comes to a river, I'm afraid it's a case we've got to learn to live with them. Otters have always been on our rivers. They should be on our rivers. Who are we to say that they shouldn't be there? I think it's a case of we might have to adapt our angling, or, as we've mentioned previously, address the bigger issue, the elephant in the room, which is barriers to migration, pollution, and water quality. I think if they're solved, then predation should be less of an issue. In terms of cormorants, it's a little bit harder because you can't keep them out as easily. Again, I'm using my local fishing club as an example. On one of our lakes, we've actually got string or rope across the lake. It looks really, really simple, but it does work. It seems to stop cormorants flying in. So there are ways to do it. There are, as we talked previously, there are multitudes of humane ways to keep cormorants away. But I think what Mark Owen from the Angling Trust mentioned earlier, the shoot to kill to scare, I think I got that right. I'd never really considered that, and you know what? I'm not sure I'd be totally against that. Now, let me not mince my words. I'm not saying I'm calling for a widespread cull of cormorants. I'm just saying that if you've tried all of the humane ways to get rid of them and it's not working, and you've got someone's livelihood at risk, or arguably something more important like salmon or another rare fish, maybe that's the way to go. I don't know. The RSPB routinely call things like foxes and corvids on their nature reserve. So I'm not totally against calls. I think as long as the science is there to back it, and it is proven to be a problem. So potentially that's a thing. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. Hopefully I don't get too much hate mail. Feel free to send it and I'll promptly chuck it in the recycle bin. This has been the Bearded Tits podcast. I've been your host, Jack Perks. Oh, actually, before I go, I should just say the podcast is back in November. I've already recorded 7 or 8 podcasts. I've done lots outside. We've got some amazing guests turning up, so do bear with me. I dare say there will be another bonus podcast before November. It's absolutely boiling as I'm recording this in my office today. If you're not following us, do follow me on Twitter at Jack Perks Photo, Facebook Jack Perks Wildlife Media, and on YouTube Jack Perks Wildlife Media as well. I should also mention buy me a coffee. I don't know if anyone will want to particularly send me money after this one, but if you are wanting to support the podcast, it's the only way that I make money from the show. So if you can send whatever you can afford, there's a link in the description to buymeacoffee.com. Anyway, this has been the Bearded Tits podcast. I will sign off now. I'm your host, Jack Perks, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Cheers.